All right, continuing with the contrast assignment. So the project I was working on was here, taking one of my exposures shot in that controlled environment, augmenting the flash, trying to bring out as much contrast as possible. I started by making a duplicate of my original exposure, playing with the levels, then making a duplicate of that, taking the hue saturation all the way down to 0, and then making a duplicate of that, just so you can see all your steps clearly as we're learning, and pushing that hue saturation up a little bit, using Colorize so it all fills. And I actually, in Documents, stored a screenshot of that, of those settings. So this is at a hue of 181 at a saturation of 7 with Colorize turned on, and making it more of a cool tone monochrome. But I don't like how all the contrast is just on the watch and everything else is pretty flat and dull. And so let's try it with another exposure. Let's just practice those same skills again. And I'm not really married to this saturation. So I'm going to close that one. I'm going to go back to my desktop. I'm going to take another one of my exposures. Open it up in Photoshop. This is also one from that space. And I immediately make a duplicate of it. We're going to learn through repetition, right? This is the long way of doing it. Once we're really comfortable with this and we understand what goes into it, then we can do some of the more shortcut ways, faster ways. So I make a duplicate of it. I go to Image Adjustments. I look at the levels in the histogram. I have a nicely mounted histogram there. It's got a high peak at the blacks, and that's just right at this edge. And that's why we're cropping. So I'm looking at this area here for the potential of the greatest contrast and value range. And we want both. And I don't really want to augment it too much, but I can brighten the lights a little bit to optimize the histogram without losing any information here. If I do it too much, I start losing information. So I use the histogram as my guide to how far I can push it. Then I say OK. Now I duplicate that with Command J. And you can already see the difference that made just in levels. Just optimizing the lighting a little bit. Now I go to Image Adjustment Saturation and I take all the color out by going to -100 in saturation. Then I duplicate that and I go to Image Adjustment Hue Saturation again, and I'm going to play with colorizing it. But the saturation can be no more than 10. And to me, 10 is really high. I want it really subtle, so maybe I'll do something like 3 this time. And then I can move the spectrum along and see what color feels right to me. Just feels like it fits the subject matter. And that looks pretty good. So maybe something about 176. And again, if you want to remember that, you can always just write it down, or you can simply say Image Adjustment, Hue Saturation. And once you set those settings, so I did a 3 and then 176, I can do Command-Shift-4 and make a quick little screen grab of those settings so I can use them on the others. All right, already I'm liking this more than what I did before. I think it has more potential for contrast in there, even though it was in the same kind of limited light conditions. And then there's no reason to limit when you shoot. So when I was manning the art club table at Rush yesterday, I got some other shots I could use. And I can apply those same steps to these. So make a duplicate of it. Adjust its levels. So you have a nice mound there, but it's heavy on the darks because of these dark trees. But I'm going to focus in on this area. And I don't want to push the brights too much because you see I'll start losing information. There's information there. So where it's safe to always play with your values is around the midtones. Now this one doesn't need much adjustment. Okay. So just a slight darkening of the midtones there. Then duplicate that, go to Hue, Image Adjustments, Hue Saturation. Take the saturation all the way down to -100, take all the color out, make a duplicate of that. Go to Image Adjustment, Hue Saturation, Colorize, and I'm going to use the settings I used before. So 176 and 3. Okay, and I'm seeing really nice potential for contrast and grayscales in there. Because we want bright lights, dark darks, and all the grays in between without ever going to solid black where you don't see any content, or solid white where you don't see any content. So even on the brightest leaf, you can still see the veins of the leaf, and that's important. And in the darkest shadow, there's still a little bit of texture in there. So it's not lost visually. All right, and then I don't think this one of my watch is going to make the cut, so I just need one more for 3 finished textures. So I have something organic, I have something man-made. Might be fun to have something that fits that theme. Maybe this one of the llama in the hall. Make a duplicate of it. So it's man-made stuff, but it looks kind of random and natural in its organization. Adjust its levels with all colors being seen. You see how all the gray values are there, but they're all in kind of equal measure. So the only thing I want to mess with is maybe pushing it a little bit darker overall or a little bit lighter overall in the midtones. But I'm not going to mess with these at all, because as soon as I do, I'm going to start losing content. Because it's a very, very balanced value exposure. Now these spikes in the white, because remember you want to watch out for exposures that spill onto the edges here. That's where those bright whites are, and those darkest darks, there's just a little bit spilling on. Those are some of those deep, deep dark shadows here. But I've got a lot of midtones I can work with, so I'm looking at cropping somewhere in here. So it's looking at the exposures for their potential. I make a duplicate, I say Image Adjustment, Hue Saturation, take it all the way down to -100, take the color out, make a duplicate of that, Image Adjustment, Hue Saturation, Colorize, and go to your desired settings. Okay, so now by doing that, all 3 of these are processed the exact same way. It doesn't mean we're done, but all of them are showcasing what I think is high contrast with a dark shadow, a bright highlight, and a lot of gray values in between, as well as showcasing interesting uses of light and form and texture. And I'm going to use these 3 because they're all just very different kinds of objects. So how do I finish this up? Well, now that it's already processed in black and white, I want to do a final levels adjustment. So I'll make another duplicate and go to Image Adjustment Levels. And now this histogram is going to look a little differently. And you can do this before you crop or actually after you crop, just to see, because if you do it after you crop, then you know that there's certain things you'll keep. But before I crop it, so at this point, once I have them all matching, I'm going to save them as PSD files. So I have all of these different layers just showing me what I did. First levels adjustment, taking all the color out, putting a little bit of color back in as a monochrome. So to do that, I say File, Save As, and I'm just going to call this Contrast Exposure 1 as a PSD to the desktop. I'm not going to close it, I'm just going to save it. And then File, Save As, Contrast exposure 2. Now these are what are called process shots. So these are getting me to where I want to go, but they're not my final project. So that's why I don't have my name under Save As. I could put my name there, as long as I know that there's 3 of them. They're not all in one file. And then File, Save As, to the desktop, Contrast, Exposure 3. As PSD files, so we have all the layers. Now it's safe for me to crop them. The reason I needed to save them before I cropped them is because cropping will lose information. And if I make a crop and then decide, you know, I really wanted it to be bigger or more angled, I wanted more options, then I would go back to one of those contrast exposure PSDs that I have on my desktop here. Okay, so how do we crop now that we've saved it? The crop tool is the 5th tool down in Photoshop. Very important because it's a shared workspace we're using. You want to make sure that all of the option windows up here are empty. Otherwise, you won't have control of the crop tool. And in order to crop, I'm going to first hold down Shift because I want to crop into a perfect square. And then I'm going to draw my square. Okay? And then what's nice about it is I can move that square around just by clicking and dragging. I like how angular and man-made this looks. But then I can also, like a transform box, rotate it. Until I can find a composition that I'm interested in. Now, you don't want to grow it beyond the edges of your photo, right? So you keep it within your photo. And you play with it. And I'm looking for something really kind of forced and angular for this. If I want to shrink it more, I hold down Shift to keep it as a square. And I bring it down. Okay, so that's step 1. And I'm squinting the whole time. I'm seeing, is that an interesting contrast exposure? Does it move my eye in a way that's engaging? And then when I like it, I hit return. And I think, yeah, I like that a lot. I just don't like that little thing. It's leading my eye in a way I don't like. It's nondescript, so I'm going to hold down Shift again. So it stays a square, and I'm just going to crop that out. And I can decide if I want to do that on this side or on the other side. It's a tough one. I'll do it right in the middle, maybe. Use my arrow keys to nudge it. Yep, about there. Okay, so now I've cropped this. I'm going to do the same thing to these. So I use the crop tool, hold down Shift, find the square I want. The bigger your square is, the better resolution potential your image has. But we're not printing these very large. We're going to print them 3 by 3 inches each. So we need not worry too much about how small we crop, unless our cameras are already very low quality. So something like that. And lastly, again, repeating, learning through repetition. Hold down Shift with the crop tool. kind of rotate it and find the composition that we think is most